If you're using your brush tool to do any type of paint work within Photoshop, and that could be masking, dodging, and burning, the actual process of digital painting, it doesn't matter. You have certain parameters or settings that become available to you. And you can also choose between different hardware input devices. So that will be your mouse or your pen and tablet, which is also pressure sensitive among other things. Whichever of those devices you might be using, those parameters or settings are pretty much the same. The only difference is that when using your pen and tablet, you can set up Photoshop in a way that applying more or less pressure to the graphic tablet with your pen will allow you to control the size of your brush and or opacity and flow. So let's take a look. Now the parameters are divided into two groups in this case. These ones I would consider more crucial, more basic, and those would be of course the size of your brush, how hard the edge of your brush is, opacity, and flow. And we also have two other parameters or settings which are dimmed down a bit here, and those would be the airbrush mode and the blend modes. Now the reason why I dim them down here is because they're not crucial, but they are useful. If you choose your brush tool by pressing the B key or by selecting it here in the toolbar, on the top you will see a bunch of options. So let's go over them real quickly. This little icon here will allow you to choose between different presets for your brush. Now in case you're not familiar with presets, they are essentially pre-recorded settings for your brush. So you can set up size of your brush, hardness, opacity, flow, and all these other different settings, and then you can save them as presets so you can quickly access those same settings later on in case you need them. If you scroll down this little arrow, you will see some additional functionality of this panel. For instance, we can open up our preset manager to load up more presets. We can reset the tool. We can load tool presets from our hard drive. If you would download them from the hard disk or transfer them from another computer, we can load up some of the presets that ships along with Photoshop as well. And also we can save our own by pressing this little icon. The next icon on the list allows us to change the size and the hardness of our brush. Down here we have a bunch of presets for our brush, but in this case they are presented as thumbnails. And if we take a look here, we have those same two icons which I just explained. This option will open up the brush panel, and this is something that we will spend some more time because we have a ton of new options here. Here we can set up the blend mode for the brush, and I will go over how much of these, especially the ones we're going to be using for dodging and burning, work, but for right now, just so you know, they're here. And the reason I dimmed them down here when naming them as parameters is because when using our brush tool to do dodging and burning, we won't be using the blend modes here in the tools option for that tool. We will be using them in the layers panel, and I will show you how that works later on. We can also choose between opacity, flow, and this icon represents the airbrush mode. And then we have these two new options, actually new icons, which are new to Photoshop CS5. And they are related to your pen and tablet if you're using it and it's pressure sensitive. I will show you how that works later on. For right now, I want to point out that these are some of the basic settings, especially these four, and you can access them here when choosing your brush tool. But if you want even more options and if you want even more control, then you have to access your brush panel. And you can get to it by either, if you have it docked here somewhere in your user interface, for instance like I do here, you can access it from the selecting your brush tool and then clicking on this icon, or if you don't have it anywhere here, you can go to window option and choose the brush setting here, or you can press the letter F5. Now let's see what we have here. Well, the brush panel has been redesigned with some additional functionality, and mostly user interface has been somewhat changed throughout different versions of Photoshop. But for our own purposes of dodging and burning, some of the basic settings will remain the same, I think, at least for 3 or 4 versions of Photoshop back in history. So if you are using maybe CS2 or even Photoshop 7, some of these settings might be available. Okay, let's take a look. First, once you choose it, you can click on this button here, and that will take you to brush presets, which are again represented, but only this time they're visually different. And I think you can even choose how you want them to look. For instance, small, large presets, large list. So this is just a preset panel, nothing more. But this is what we're interested in: brush tip shape and these options down here. Now, brush tip shape, that will take you to what I referred to as kind of like the main settings area. Down here we have our brush preview option. We can create new brush preset and so on, but for right now let's focus on this area. Again, we have our brush presets that seem to be everywhere. In this case, they are presented as the small thumbnails. And these presets here, which look a bit different, they're new to CS5 and they correspond to the new brush tool. You can find it here. It's called the Mixer Brush tool, and it uses some new settings like the bristle tips to simulate how the actual brush might work when painting on actual canvas. Only this time it's presented in digital form. So let's see what other settings we have. Well, we have of course our size and hardness, which will be the really basic settings. Size, and if you take a look at the preview, you can see how it works. Size determines the size of your brush. That's the size of the stroke of your brush. That's pretty easy to understand. And the hardness affects how hard the edge of your brush will be. If I lower the hardness value to 0, I can see that the hardness of my brush is actually quite soft now. The edge of the brush is quite soft. This is pretty good if you're doing any type of organic work. So if you're dodging and burning human face or any type of portraiture or nature maybe, or anything like that, anything organic, then this is a better setting for you. If you're masking, then you might consider using, especially if you're masking for not for dodging and burning, but for other purposes like color correction, then some of these settings might work better for you. We have spacing option, and we'll go over that in a second. Let me just first explain how these flip X and Y axis option or two checkboxes work. Since I'm using my round brush, and you can see on the canvas how the preview looks, these options really won't do anything because it's just a circle. But if I were to choose another brush like this one, which can be used to paint grass, and I think it ships along with Photoshop as well, and if I choose the flip axis X and Y, they will switch my brush and I will see now the effect, which is in this case really relevant, but when we're using the rounded brush it wasn't so relevant. We won't be using those two options. Angle and roundness, well, let me just first open up my original brush by choosing a preset. Well, angle and roundness. First of all, roundness determines how round the brush you're using is. In this case, I turned it into a ellipse. This arrow here represents what the angle is. It's set to 0%. If I were to change it, you can see how now it changes the angle at which I'm painting on. Again, something we won't be using, so I won't be focusing on that. I'm just going to reset those values to their default settings. And spacing option, now that's the interesting one. I think I would personally explain it like the rate at which color comes out of your brush, quote unquote. It's a bit of an abstract term, but let me show you what I mean. If my brush is actually now set to hardness 100%, and if I were to increase my spacing option to, let's say, 57%, now you can see these jagged or round edges on my brush. And in case you're wondering why is that, well, brush line or brush stroke actually consists of different individual dots. And when I increase my brush spacing to 145%, I can see the individual dots, and I can definitely see some spacing between them. Now, in case you're wondering why do we need this, well, I'm not exactly sure. That's something that I'll have to ask Adobe. But I found two uses for it beyond some special effects. For instance, I can use it to paint a dotted line. I can also use it if I wanted to see how some of these other settings work. It's very good for demonstration purposes, and that's exactly what I'm going to be using it for. So right now, let's leave it at 145%. And let's take a look at these other options. First of all, they're divided into two sections, and they're divided by this line. This top section, if any of those you choose, it will allow you a different additional sliders and options. But down here, these options don't have any additional sliders. They just have this checkbox for on and off. You can lock the settings by selecting this lock icon. But if you're using some of these settings, first let me explain what they are. Noise basically adds, and let me show you how that works. Just adds noise to your brush. It can be used for special effects. It can be used to add some illusion of texture. It can be used to avoid bending when working with really large brushes. The problem is there's no slider for it. It's just on and off option. Wet edges, they do pretty much what you would expect. Airbrush mode, that's pretty much as activating it here. And I will go what airbrush mode does in the next video a lot more. Smoothing option, I think I haven't seen the actual effect for it, but I think smoothing option just determines how smooth your brush pads are, or brushing when you're using your pads. At least that's what it says, but I'm not sure how exactly does it work. Didn't see too much use for it, but it's always on, so I'll leave it on. Protect texture. Well, if you go to this option here, you can choose different textures for your brush. So when you're painting with the texture. And you can choose your scale, depth, and other parameters here. But when you choose to protect your texture, well, that means if you choose some kind of a pattern for your texture and using a large brush, well, that's great because the texture kind of corresponds to the size of your brush. But if you were to lower your brush and you still want the texture to scale, not to remain like a large scale pattern, just want it to scale along with the brush, then you would use the protect texture. Dual brushes, well, that allow you to use two brushes at the same time with different settings. Color dynamics, that uses different color found here on foreground and background swatches, and they allow you to paint with one stroke and apply two different colors. Pretty useful for digital painting and special effects. We have scattering. Well, scattering allows us to scatter those individual dots when painting with our brush tool, and we have some other things like count and some other options, but since we're not going to be using that, we're not going to spend too much time on it. The two options that are unique to dodging and burning, I mean they're very useful for dodging and burning, and we will be spending some more time on it, will be the shape dynamics and the transfer option. Now if you're using an older version of Photoshop like CS4, then transfer option here is used to be called other dynamics. So for you it would say other dynamics. Now first let me explain something. When you're using your mouse, because you don't affect anything with pressure sensitivity, you don't have that option, then you're using just your size, hardness, opacity, and flow, and those settings can be found here. So for dodging and burning, this and this setting do not concern you. They become irrelevant pretty much. All you need to worry yourself about is opacity, flow, airbrush mode, size, and hardness, which all of them can be accessed up here. However, if you're using your pen, which is pressure sensitive, to do dodging and burning, then these settings, these two sub-settings become available, and became relevant. Let me explain how they work. And to do that, I'm just going to expand my canvas for pen by going to this option and choosing this icon. So let me explain to you. I will just open up the brush tip shape and I will lower my spacing for this next demonstration. I will also use my hardness at 100% and I will choose the size of my brush a bit bigger. Now at this point I'm going to use my brush tool, but I'm painting with not with pen but with the mouse. When I paint, you can see what happened. The size of my brush remained the same, and the opacity of my brush remained the same. And now I'm going to switch to my pen tool, which is pressure sensitive. I'm going to paint, and you can see it pretty much did the same thing. Now, in case you're wondering, and in case this happens to you, and let's say you go out, you buy your brush, your pen and tablet, which is, pressure sensitive, you go into Photoshop, you paint with it, and you realize that, wait a minute, nothing is happening. There's no difference between painting with pen tool and painting with my mouse. Well, the reason for that is that you have to set up some of the settings here. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So let's see how shape dynamics works first. We have a bunch of sliders up here. Size, angle, and roundness, as well as flip X and Y. Those options correspond to brush tip shape section, where we have size, hardness, flip X, Y, angle, and roundness. So all those settings, except of course the hardness, are available here. But the word now, it's not just size, it also has this jitter assigned to it. Now jitter essentially means randomness. And what exactly does that mean? Well, if I go to brush tip shape and I increase my spacing, so you can see those individual dots, and if I now use my size jitter slider, you will see what's happening a lot clearer, a lot better. So let me increase that size jitter option. And what it does, it affects the size of those individual dots, but because of the jitter word, it uses some random algorithm to affect individual dots completely randomly. Jitter essentially means randomness. Minimum diameter, that's the size. What's the minimum diameter of the smallest dot when you're using the size jitter? Angle and roundness, as well as these two, they affect these options, but since we're not using them, they really don't have any use for us here. Now let's switch to transfer. It used to be called other dynamics. Here we have those same sliders for opacity and flow, which correspond to this opacity and flow, but we have the word jitter assigned to them again. Now jitter again means randomness, which means that if I increase it, I will randomly lower the opacity of the individual dots. And the same thing is true for flow. Let's get back to shape dynamics. In shape dynamics and in transfer, it used to be called other dynamics, all those sliders is something we're not going to be using. What we are going to be using is this option under control, and we can switch between different options, but we're going to be focusing primarily on pen pressure. And you can see down here what had happened. Now, to give you a better illustration, I'm going to lower my spacing and get back here. This only works if you have a pressure sensitive tablet. And when you have this control option set to pen pressure, what will happen is that when you paint on your canvas, less pressure you apply, the size of your brush will be really small. It will be really thick, thin. And then when you apply more pressure, you will increase the size of your brush. Less pressure, smaller size of the brush. So this option here allows you to control the size of your brush using your pen pressure sensitivity. Now let's see how that works. I'm switching to my pressure sensitive pen and tablet right now, and let me show you. I'm applying a little pressure. The size of my brush isn't that big, and then when I apply gradually more pressure, the size of my brush becomes bigger. So that is how you see exactly what would happen on the preview option. Now let's deactivate that for a second and let's try this other option, transfer. It used to be called other dynamics, remember? We have opacity and flow jitter, which we won't use, but we will use is, again, option under control to affect the flow and the opacity with our pressure sensitivity, like I wrote it here. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if I apply less pressure, the opacity or the flow of my brush will decrease. I will have a semi-opaque brush. And then when I increase the pressure of my brush, I will also increase the opacity of my brush. So let's see how that works. I will apply less pressure, and then when I apply gradually more pressure, I'm changing the opacity of my brush. Again, low pressure, and I can see the effect. Now let's get back into history and see how both of those work. And they work pretty much as you would expect. If you apply a low amount of pressure, you will not only work with small size brush, but it will also be quite transparent. More pressure, the size of your brush grows, as well as the opacity value. Let's see how that works. So less pressure, small brush size, and not opaque. And then when I increase the pressure, I'm painting with larger size brush, and it's not transparent anymore. And I will again lower the size of my brush. So that is how these options work together. Now for a moment I will deactivate them, and I will show you what these two icons do, and they're new to Photoshop CS5. So if I were to click on this option, I will activate one of these two options. I believe I'm affecting this one right now. So what you need to know is that these icons represent this and this option. And there is unfortunately a bug that's found within user interface which prevents us to really see this in real time. So first, before I even demonstrate it to you, I'm just going to prove that there is a bug. If I click on this icon, I think this option should be on, but it's not. The checkbox is not on. And to prove that it's working, I'm applying less pressure, more pressure. So based on my pen pressure sensitivity, I'm affecting opacity of my brush. And you can see now that it became available here. But after I went through the history, let me deactivate that for a moment and deactivate it here. I'm going to activate it again. And this time I'm going to collapse my panel. So I'm going to refresh the user interface. When I open it again, you can see that now the checkbox is on. What does that mean? Well, I think it could only be a bug within user interface. The same is true for this one. If I activate that one, this option should be on, but it's not. I mean, it's working if I were to paint, but it's not indicated here. So if I were to collapse my palette, open it again, I can see now it's working. And of course, if I were to paint with those options, again, the same thing happens. I'm combining the effects of opacity and size based on my pressure. Now, there's something else I wanted to show you here. And that is that worth noting is that if I'm going to deactivate this one and I'm going to deactivate these two options. So I'm just going to leave this one here in the panel. And I'm going to switch under flow, I'm going to switch from control to pen pressure. Here's an interesting point. Now, when I click on this icon, I should activate the transfer option. And it should remember these settings, right? Well, it won't. It will only remember and will only activate the opacity control. So let me show you. I'm going to deactivate it here. And you can see it immediately. This one stayed pen pressure, but this one went to control, went to off. And even when I activate my airbrush mode, let me show you. When I deactivate it, it immediately switched this one off. So the same thing would have happened if I were going to deactivate my airbrush mode for a second. If I were to now deactivate it here and activate it here, I'm going to collapse my palette to refresh the user interface, and I can see that again it's deactivated here. Even if I switch it to pen pressure when I'm using this option, this will remain off. The only way I can use this one and this one if I manually switch it here on the transfer option and without this one. That's the only way I can control flow as well as opacity, or just one of them, using my pen pressure. Only way to manually activate it here. And those would be the parameters, and those would be the difference when using your pressure sensitive tablet as opposed to using your mouse. That's how you can get to these settings.